After studying this module, you should be able to understand the terms cross-cultural measurement, know the types of equivalences, know the statistical techniques of comparison, understand the strategies to assess invariance. Cross-cultural measurement always has to deal with the issue of cultural and ethnic biases involved during the differences in the nature characteristic of cultures. Most of the measurement is in the area of behaviors, intelligence, aptitude and the attitude. Tests dealing with measurement of attributes which are universal in the nature and those which have meaning embedded in local cultures context will have different ways to address the issue of biases. Triandis in 1978 suggested universality cultural continuum is linked to the abstractness of a concept. If a concept is universal, it is difficult to make comparisons between cultures. However, if the concept is abstract, one can make greater comparison regarding the specificities of culture. Many reviews have found that there is lack of methodological rigor in cross-cultural studies. As on reviews, there are 5 main stages of research. First stage involves defining the problem. Second is choosing a perspective, etic or emic. Third involves designing the research and deciding tools for measurement. Fourth stage involving data collection, and finally interpreting and analyzing the results. Each of these stages have certain issues and some of the pertinent issues have been discussed in this chapter. If the issue of equivalence is not addressed significantly during research, then it may lead to misguided conclusions and interpretations in the research. For a conclusive comparison of data collected from research from different cultures, the criteria of equivalence of data needs to be established first. Data equivalence implies that data must have same level of accuracy of measurement and hence similar interpretation and thus similar validity and reliability across cultures being compared. The issue of equivalence needs to be examined before data collection starts. Also, once the data has been collected, it needs to correctly analyze for measurement invariance. Third, the methodological issues at various stages of research process. The assumption of equivalence among cultures is central to making cross-cultural comparisons. In research design, 3 types of equivalences need to be established: construct equivalence, measure equivalence and sampling equivalence. Construct equivalence also consists of 3 kinds of equivalence: functional, conceptual and category equivalence. Functional equivalence means that the object of study, concepts or behaviors have similar functions across cultures. It implies that the use of the object or performance of the behavior have similar purposes. Conceptual equivalence, it implies that the cultures to be compared should have similar meanings of the same concept and only then comparisons can be made. In addition, the concept should have a functional relevance and equivalence in the cultures, such as similar situation in both cultures, produce similar outcomes of behavior. Sears in 1961 gave 3 criteria for conceptual or functional equivalence. 1. If there are similar universal learning situation. 2. Whether the goals are identified. And 3. Whether the same antecedent consequent relation can be established in all cultures. Category equivalence implies that both the cultures share similar ways of classification of objects, concepts and behaviors such as definitions of constructs and concepts, socioeconomic classes and demographic characteristics. The researcher should be very observant about the issue of construct equivalence, as a problem at this stage could lead to misleading results. Hence, a pilot study or preliminary examination should be done through qualitative methods to explore the issue of conceptual equivalence. Measure equivalence. The stage of research design also needs to check for equivalence of the measure that is to be measured in different cultures. This issue also encompasses the operational equivalence, as the measure needs to be operationally defined first. Operational equivalence implies two similar ways of operationalization of a construct to measure it. If it is similar in both cultures, then results obtained can also be compared. Once the construct is operationalized, the items developed in different tests instrument across cultures should have similar interpretation when read by respondents from different cultures. This is a means to achieve item equivalence, which will help measure the same construct through identical items. To address the issue of measure equivalence, three things need to be considered: translation, calibration, and metric equivalence. Translation. To translate means converting the research instrument in the native or prevalent language of the culture in which the study is to be done, such that the respondent have same or common understanding of the items. Thus, it deals with a similar meaning rather than simply literal translation. Translation techniques such as direct translation, back translation, parallel translation, etc. have been suggested. The issue of translation is discussed in detail in another chapter. Calibration equivalence relates to the units used in measurement. For example, unit for weight, whether it is in kilograms, ounces, etc. or distance in miles, kilometers, etc. Also monetary units such as rupees, pounds or dollars. If items use these units, then they need to be converted so that it can be understood by the respondents. Hence, the units of measurement need to be comparable across cultures. Metric equivalence can be achieved through scalar equivalence and equivalence of the scale or scoring procedure. Scalar equivalence is equivalence in which the same magnitude of score obtained in both tests implies equal intensity of the attribute possessed by the person. For example, anxiety score of 80 means similar high level of anxiety in both cultures. When instruments have scalar equivalence, they can be readily compared. This implies that different individuals from different cultures possessing the same magnitude or value of a trait will obtain the same score. Scoring procedure implies that in different cultures, the scales used are equivalent and comparable, such as categories are used in surveys or Likert scale, 5-point or 7-point. Results obtained from analysis of such categories are comparable. 4. Statistical techniques for cross-cultural comparisons. One of the most common techniques used to compare two cultures is the simple t-test. The use of the t-test assumes that the construct being measured is present in both the cultures being studied. The test used in one culture is translated into the language of the another culture and used on the sample. The means obtained are compared to check for significant differences. Also, if many cultures are compared simultaneously, then multiple analysis of variance is performed. Many researchers in cross-cultural area use this methodology. However, some have questioned the reliability of these studies. Second, regression analysis. It assumes that the scores obtained from the similar scale in different cultures will be related to an external criterion, also if they are measuring the same construct in different cultures. The factors that may bring in changes in scores are the variability of the subjects being studied in different cultures and also the reliability of measure in the groups. Also, the difference in the scores can be attributed to the relation of the construct being studied to another criterion through irrelevance for the study. However, even with these problems, this approach is both economical and easy to use. Co-scoring method. The co-scoring methods are based on the data that have same items or variables in different groups, which is supposedly due to the conceptual or functional equivalence of the measure. These methods have also made the assumption that the instrument used to measure have the factors or constructs operationalized in the same manner. There are many methods used to arrive at common metric in comparing groups. Cattell in 1957 used the transcultural method. In this method, one representative person is taken from each culture to be compared and factorization is conducted on the sample. Cattell proposes three techniques of selection. One, by randomly picking one sample from each culture. From this method, the factors on which different subjects can be compared However, when the pattern of within group variance is very different from the intergroup covariance, these factors become meaningless or uninterpretable. Second, method involves random selection of one person from each culture. Then, for each person a standard score is calculated with respect to his relative position in his group. In Catel's honor, the factor derived are called as transcultural dimensions of individual deviations. These are greater in abstraction level and different from the variables the researcher was studying. Third approach involves calculation of the mean score for each group on each variable can now be factored. Hence, here only within group variance is left and between group variance is eliminated. This approach explains more of the ecological dimensions, which explain groups more than the individuals. This method should be used with a theory and a reasonable hypothesis regarding the presence of the construct in all cultures. Item response theory. Item response theory (IRT) is another technique to assess equivalence by examining the differential functioning of each item. It implies to assess the extent to which each item is used in the scale function in the same manner in the research context. IRT is also useful with the multiple ordered response categories. IRT uses parameters derived internally and not external criterion. In IRT, item characteristic curves are derived for each of the cultures. Item characteristic curves shows the chances or tendencies of responding to an item in a specified manner at certain intervals. Statistical tests are used to determine the differences in ICCs of different cultures. Differences indicate the lack of equivalence on that particular item in the cultures being compared. Also, item equivalence and scalar equivalence is reflected in similar item characteristics curve. Response pattern method. The response pattern method deals with the item equivalence. For skills and personality tests, the frequency of endorsement of each item in both the cultures are correlated. In case of aptitude and ability test, the order of ranking are correlated. It is called as the delta plot by Irwin in 1965. It is based on the assumption that the rank of difficulty indicated that some items are more difficult in one culture than the other. Hence, it implies that same items may not measure the same attribute in both cultures. However, one does not know how high the correlation coefficient should be to assume item equivalence. Translation techniques. Good translation helps deal with low item equivalence. Various methods such as back translation, decentering, pre-testing and bilingual and committee approach have been proposed by Brislin in 1970, 76 and 80. All translation techniques aims at mediating between linguistic boundaries, changing from one language to another without changing the basic ideas and meanings of items and scales. Internal structure congruence. Internal structure implies the dimensions or components of the construct being measured. It works on the assumption that if the nature of construct is same across cultures, then it will have the same components and same relation between components in the two cultures. To understand the components, statistical techniques are used. A. Factor analysis. It is the most common methods to analyze construct. Cattell in 1969 and 78 discusses 5 methods to match the factors obtained from different samples. These are Burt-Tucker congruence coefficient, the salient variable similarity index, the configurated transformative method, the pattern similarity coefficient and conformity maximum likelihood index. The combined use of these methods give researchers great confidence for cross-cultural inferences. B. Multi-dimensional scaling. Hugh and Schreindis in 1982 suggested this method to test and improve equivalence. In this, judges are selected from each culture and are asked to judge the similarity of pairs of items of the instrument. Then, multi-dimensional models are used to extract the dimensions on which judges make their judgments. The individual differences scaling model by Carroll and Chang in 1970 helps one to identify the differences in emphasis, importance and priorities given by judges or peoples from different culture. C. Maximum likelihood factor analysis. Conformity factor analysis is becoming more popular in this cross-cultural research. The multi-group CFA is most often used method. Hierarchical nested models are used to obtain empirical values of various kinds of variance such as metric invariance, scalar invariance, configure invariance, factor variance invariance, factor covariance invariance, and latent mean invariance. The objective of the study determines the invariance to be obtained. For example, if the goal is to compare means of different cultures, then metric and scalar invariances need to be obtained. If it is simply to explore the nature of construct across countries, then configural invariance is obtained. Simultaneous factor analysis in several populations developed by Jorskov in 1971 looks for similarities and differences in the factor structure for the different cultures. In this technique, a variance-covariance matrix of the measured variable is made for each sample. Next, a fit between this matrix and factor analytic model is made. The values of factor loading, factor variance and covariance etc. parameter are prefixed. Using Lizarel package, the maximum likelihood model estimation is used to check for fitness. A chi-score goodness of fit for large sample is used in conclusion and shows if one factor can be derived for similarities in data from different groups. Another theory that assesses invariance is the generalizability theory, G theory. It aims to estimate the extent to which a measure assessed during particular conditions can be generalized to other conditions too. These conditions could be different cultures, subjects, scale items, style of administration, different time spaces, countries, etc. These conditions have been termed as facets. The application of G theory was tested by Sharma and Weathers in 2003 for the first time to assess the use of a scale across nations. The G theory provides a lot of information on the reasons for variation across countries. This helps the researcher to know the exact cause of variation, be it the subjects or sample chosen. The items of the scale, nature or dimensions of the construct or countries, it is also the advantage of being used. If certain conditions are not met, such as large sample size, it is also useful for multi-dimensional constructs. However, it is less statistically rigorous than the confirmatory factor analysis. Multi-strategy method. Another choice of researcher is to use a combination of methods when dealing with various kinds of equivalences. Every method has its advantages and disadvantages. Some methods have strong assumptions and some have strong limitations, are highly mathematical and statistical. The use of many methods can help resolve the problem of different methods and address the issue of equivalence better. Hence, a researcher should use multi-strategy approach and avoid using a single method while doing cross-cultural research. Doing this can help establish equivalence at all levels of abstraction and make accurate and precise cross-cultural comparisons. Summary: cross-cultural measurement always has to deal with the issue of cultural and ethnic biases involved due to differences in nature, characteristics of culture. Most of the measurement is in the area of behavior, intelligence, aptitude and attitude. Tests dealing with the measurement of attributes which are universal in the nature and those which have meaning embedded in local cultural context will have different ways to address the issue of biases. Triandus in 1978 suggested that the universality cultural continuum is linked to the abstractness of a concept. If a concept is universal, it is difficult to make comparisons between culture. However, if the concept is abstract, one can make greater comparisons regarding the specificities of culture. For a conclusive comparison of data collection from research and from different cultures, the criteria of equivalence of data needs to be established first. Data equivalence implies that the data must have same level of accuracy of measurement. Hence, similar interpretation and thus similar validity and reliability across cultures being compared. The issue of equivalence needs to be examined even before data collection starts. Also, once the data has been collected, it needs to correctly analyzed for measurement in variance. There are various techniques suggested for cross-cultural comparison. One of the most common techniques used to compare two cultures is the simple t-test. The use of the t-test assumes that the construct being measured is present in both the cultures being studied. Other techniques are regression analysis, co-scoring method, item response theory, response pattern method, translation techniques, etc. The internal structure congruence technique is also used in cross-cultural comparisons. It employs factor analysis, multi-dimensional scaling, maximum likelihood factor analysis. However, it has been found that the use of many methods can help resolve the problem of different methods and address the issue of equivalence better. Hence, researchers should use multi-strategy approach and avoid using a single method while doing cross-cultural research. However, this can help establish equivalence at all levels of abstraction and make accurate and precise cross-cultural comparisons.